they require me to interview like at least 2 people, credible sources for each piece that I write. So you want to make sure that you know that you have to do things like this. You also want to ask them about your fee. This is really important, because if you don't ask them about how much you're going to get paid, they'll just simply assume that you don't need to be paid and that you don't care. And you can't really ask for money afterwards because you won't have any bargaining power. You've already written the piece. What do you want to say? You should also read every word of your contract, if there is a contract. And it's really, it is tempting to, once someone shows interest in a piece, especially if it's a big magazine or newspaper, it can be tempting to want to replicate the success or take the same idea elsewhere and package it in a different way. But you shouldn't do this. I mean, people will find out, especially now that we have the internet. It's not that difficult to find out if you've been writing about the same thing for different publications. It's not only not ethical, but you'll also be violating any contracts in place. So just don't push your luck, really. You've gotten, 1 gig, and just stick with that. And you should also always manage expectations. So if you think you can write an article, let's say in a week's time, what I usually do is tell a magazine that I'll be in touch with the draft in a month's time. I know I'll finish it much sooner than then, but it takes a whole lot of pressure off of me, and it also impresses them in the end, because if you submit something much sooner than the fact, that's always good. You don't want to send something late. And once you say okay, that's really it. You should stick to your word. Again, it's tempting to, this happened to me recently actually. I had submitted an idea. I pitched the same subject to, well, of course, a bunch of different publications, and 2 of them got in touch with me and they were interested, but I had accepted one magazine's offer before the magazine it was my dream to write for these guys. They got in touch like half an hour later, but there was nothing I could do because nobody wants to work with 2-timers, and it's just unethical, and you just shouldn't do it, really. There's nothing more I can say about with respect to that. The opportunity will arise to write for those other publications again, and that happened to me. I ended up writing for them actually just a few weeks later. So once you say okay, that's really it. You can't go back. You shouldn't go back on your word. And you don't really need to tell other publications that you've accepted someone else's offer, because chances are, well, first of all, they won't believe you, and chances are that they won't even consider your piece. So it's not that important. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, this can be, freelance journalism altogether can be about so much more than just writing pieces. It can open so many doors, and you should think about writing about ideas that, for instance, can give you the opportunity to talk to influential people, for instance. That's one thing that attracted me to writing about fashion, being able to interview all these designers, being able to go to shows. But even if I'm not writing about fashion, I always try to see what I can do with a particular idea or piece. I was talking about this the other day with Hushida during my talk. I wrote a piece a few years ago about the influence of Iranian carpets on so many different things, like Renaissance art and fashion. And as part of my research, I reached out to one very well-known fashion designer, Anna Sweet. So that's just an instance of the things that you can do with, or as a journalist, as a freelance writer. Especially if you're writing for a big publication, that's also why writing for bigger publications is so important. Once you have a name like the New York Times behind you or the BBC, everybody wants to talk to you. Nobody wants to do interviews for small-time publications. So try to reach out to as many people as you can, and and Anna Sweet. So she's a designer, and I talked to her about her use of paisley designs in her line of work. So people don't even necessarily need to be in the same field you're writing about. You could be writing about literature and interview, musicians and vice versa. And you want to send emails to really as many agents and managers as you can, and you'll be lucky if a handful reply to you. So the same logic applies to, it's the same with getting in touch with editors. You want to get in touch with as many as possible, because really if even a few get back to you, you're lucky. And you should, when you can, opt for face-to-face interviews instead of, telephone is halfway between. It's second best, but the worst is email. Not only because, when you get to meet someone, they get a feeling for you as a person, and you develop not an intimate relationship with them, but it's much more meaningful, and it can lead to so much more. But when you talk to someone, or you don't talk to them, you correspond with them over email. They don't know who you are, and when you're doing the interview, you lose all the nuances that you get when doing a face-to-face or even a telephone interview. So you don't get those pauses, you don't, no emotion gets through, and people really, when they're writing responses to questions they've received over email, they go over everything very carefully, and they're much more conservative. So there are a lot of things that don't get said that would otherwise have gotten said, over the phone or in a face-to-face interview. So that's always the best. So when you can, meet someone. If you can't, call them over the phone, but don't do anything over email. And you want to be transparent with people. So if you're getting in touch with celebrities and their agents, they'll want to know what the piece is for, when it's going to be published approximately, and this is really important, who else you're interviewing, because they don't want to be in the company of people beneath them. They always want to be in the company or in the presence but the company of people either at the same level as they are or who are superior to them. So if no one else has, given you confirmation for an interview, you can at least say who you've gotten in touch with. But the last thing you want to do is lie to them and tell them that, I've got, all these other interviews lined up. And, then when they see that that's not the case, they're never going to want to talk to you again. So it's just not something that you want to do. So honesty is best, as always. So you've submitted the piece. There's still more frustration to be had. It doesn't really end here. So you're going to have to be really patient. It can take months for your pieces to get published. And editors, they always tell me, I ask them approximately when is the piece going to come out. They say next week, and it never comes out that week. And they tell me next month, and before you know it, 6 months have gone by, and still the piece hasn't come out. You'll be lucky if they tell you when they plan to publish the piece. They usually don't, and if they do give you a date, they won't stick to it probably. Even if it's a time-sensitive article you've written, I've found this to be the case, unfortunately. I don't write about politics, but I wrote a piece that had to do with Iran-US relations recently, and it was a very time-sensitive piece, but they just wouldn't publish it, and instead there would be, all these articles about cats and dogs coming out, and I didn't see what the relevance was, so it can be really frustrating. So even if you've written something that you think should come out as soon as possible the next day, it can take months. Even an editor of mine recently told me you might have to wait even 11 months for your piece to come out. This makes payment a bit problematic as well, because you're usually paid a month after you submit a piece. So if the piece comes out in 6 months' time, you can expect to be paid. If they pay you in 7 months' time. And the philosophy here really is I mean, I'm fortunate enough to work with publications that sometimes pay me even before I've written anything for them, but they're really rare. Usually the mentality is, if you want your money, come chase me. And if you don't, they won't pay you. So you really have to keep an eye on your bank account and follow up with these people. And unfortunately, that's the way it works a lot of the time. You should expect drastic modifications to your piece. I mean, if you think that what you write is what will appear in print or online, that's not how it's going to work. Sometimes publications, if you ask them, they will be kind enough to send you a draft of what they intend to publish before they do so. But again, this is very rare, and what usually happens is that you'll see your piece in print or online, and you won't even be able to recognize it sometimes. This is just a fact, and if you're very sensitive about things like this, which a lot of our writers were, I mean, even though I would send them drafts, you shouldn't get into this then, because it's just the way it works. I mean, that's why they have editors there. I mean, that's what they do. They edit pieces, and sometimes you should even expect to rewrite pieces altogether. That's very frustrating, and it can be tempting to just, get back at an editor and tell them that they don't know what they're talking about, or simply refuse to comply with their wishes. But remember, they don't need you, and you don't matter to them. So, and you've already written the piece, so it shows that you really want to get published. So you don't have a whole lot of bargaining power, and you just have to really, just do what they say, I guess. I know you can get emotional about these things. I mean, sometimes, I don't get emotional now, but I did have the tendency to get, it is frustrating, but I just usually give it a bit of time, and then, you go back and you see what you can do, how you can best accommodate both their wishes and stay true to what you've written. But this does usually happen. It's not a rare occurrence, for an editor to get in touch and say, Joobin, I need you to just do this from scratch. This won't work. And you want to keep your interviews posted. So, yes.
Quick question here. So, have you ever found yourself in a situation that you had to censor yourself to conform to their political views or their values, which are in conflict with your values?
Yes.
Yes. How did you handle that?
Well, now that I'm not really, I do write about Iran quite a bit, but I haven't had any problems thus far since working as a freelancer. But when I was running Reorient, I remember some cultural organizations in the Middle East, they had issues with certain terms that we would use. Like, I remember I was supposed to interview someone from some foundation in, I don't know, where it was, like Qatar or Kuwait or somewhere. And they said, you can't use the term Persian Gulf in the interview. So we just didn't do it. Or there was another writer who, she was insistent that Nezami, the poet, was born in Azerbaijan. And when I responded that there was no such country at the time, and that the historical Azerbaijan is in Iran, she had an issue with that. And she'd written the piece, and we'd gone so far, we'd taken it so far, but in the end I just couldn't do anything with it because, I couldn't, how should I put this? I wasn't willing to make a compromise in that respect. We had to be accurate. But thus far, no, I've been lucky in that I haven't had to censor myself, really. I don't write about politics, so it makes my life a bit easier. But there are certain things that I'm willing to compromise on, but other things like, I don't know, the historical names, or I'm trying to think of other examples. There are touchy subjects that, it would either be, my way or nothing else. But most of the time, usually not a big deal, but sometimes I would never accept, I would never yield to someone's wishes. You know, someone who would ask me to use, like, they would say, for instance, you can't write Persian Gulf, you have to write the Arabian Gulf, and I can't do something like that. But otherwise, most of the time it's okay, really. So, yeah, that's the last thing I wanted to say. It can take a long time for your pieces to come out, so you don't want to leave your interviewees in the dark. You always want to keep them posted as to what's happening, because your reputation is on the line. So you don't want them to think that maybe, you know, he hadn't even been commissioned to write a piece, and this was all just an excuse to interview, you know, this individual, or maybe the piece turned out so badly that it's not even a single line a day. You just want to keep them posted. So if you hear that, you hear back from an editor who says it's going to take, you know, 5 months for the piece to come out, that's fine. Just communicate that to all the people you've been in touch with. They won't have an issue. I mean, they're not in a rush, and they can keep their pants on. And yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, really, you're only as good as your last performance, so you better make it a good one. Doesn't matter, you know, how many pieces you've written for publication, whether you're friends with an editor or not. There are no friends in this business. It is a business. They'll look at the last piece that you wrote for them, and if it didn't perform well, then it's not that they're never going to work with you again, but that's what they'll remember. So write everything as if it's the last thing you'll ever write, and just do the best job that you can possibly do. I do this with respect to everything, really. It's unfortunate that this is the case, but it's a reality. You are really only as good as your last performance. So that's what I had to say about this subject. Does anyone have any questions?
I do have another question. So at some point you mentioned that the editors don't really need people to write for them. But if you put yourself in their shoes, they also are under pressure to come up with good content. And I've seen people to actually have to go and put some effort into browsing into what's out there, finding good people. And I wanted to see if I can engage an advocate here to see from a publisher's point of view, or an editor's point of view, how would you go about like, evaluating what's out there and selecting people? Or you should just sit down and wait for people to send you their work?
No, I don't. But you know, my case as an academic may be different from the case of someone who is a freelance writer and has to find an editor, a paper, a book, organization, or whatever to publish. So I think there are different kinds of writings and writers. Perhaps one of the things you might want to advise is what constitutes a freelance writer, and if someone really has had it with freelance writing, what are the other options? You know, in academia, you are pushed to become an expert in something that very few people know. Really very few people know. So you become a kind of an expert in something that almost no one else knows in the world. And so you become the disseminator of what you know. I found your two examples of the Persian Gulf and Nizami very interesting and very, perhaps, occasions for further creativity. Maybe someone could then think of something, an article on how it came that became a controversial name, the Persian Gulf. It never was. And the Arabs of the world throughout the ages have always called it the Persian Gulf. So Khalij al-Farasi. And it goes back to the Greeks and the Byzantines and all of that. So maybe if you know that in that piece of information, then definitely not with that editor, because he's obviously he has chosen his side. But you can maybe enlighten others through other means of what constitutes the historical truth. in something. Or the case of Azerbaijan, similarly, what I would like to also say to you is that there was no Iran between the coming of Islam and the establishment of the Safavids. So for 800 years, between the 7th century and the 16th century, there really was no country of Iran. The land was there, and the area was known as Iran, the land of Iran. But it did not constitute a country, a nation state, as we understand it today. So perhaps a compromising position, which is not deviating from the truth, is Nizami was born in a place which today is called Azerbaijan. If your editor accepts that's quite acceptable to me.
Yeah, the writer wasn't willing to make a compromise, and she insisted that he was born
in Azerbaijan,
which is incorrect.
Yeah, that's a lie, because there was no Azerbaijan, but then there was no Iran either. It was Caucasus, and it was like the Islamic Empire. The Islamic Empire was there, and all of these were pieces. And Iran was truly much more important than Azerbaijan. And the word Azerbaijan was not there because it was Caucasus. It was Western Caspian, or whatever, Western Caspian. So, but perhaps and this is what I want to emphasize, occasions like that are not totally negative. Maybe they're negative for not being able to work with that editor. But how is it that one can find one's own way towards the truth without compromising anything?
Definitely, and these always give rise to so many opportunities to discuss these lesser known subjects. But sometimes, like, I don't know, publications, they have their own agendas. And they say this is the way that, this is how we refer to this body of water or this geographic area, or I don't know, they have an agenda to promote one political party over another. And there's just something you can do, but there's so many publications, so many other ones, you can just take your idea elsewhere. You don't necessarily need to write for the same publication all the time, and not all ideas are a good fit. I think I missed that slide completely. There was something else I wanted to say in that respect, but sometimes ideas just aren't. So if you get rejected, if the piece gets rejected, sometimes it's simply because the idea isn't a good fit for the magazine. Sometimes, like, I pitch ideas and I'm told that they're too scholarly and that they'll go over people's heads, and it's not appropriate for that publication. And I understand that. It's nothing to do with me. It's just, as they say, it's not me, it's you. It's not you, it's me, sorry. But they'd be saying that to me. That's why when I pitch ideas, I pitch them to not just one publication at a time, but to so many different ones.
You have to find your own place to pitch. What journal, is likely to understand the argument that you're making about the Persian Gulf, for example? It certainly would not be an Arab journal right now.
No.
But it could work with the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever. The historicity of that body of water really makes it quite abundantly clear. And so when Iranians want to counter the misnomer that's the Arabian Gulf, they have to point out there is a large body of water called the Arabian Sea to the east of India. And so, different countries, there's even the Gulf of Oman, that's Oman, that little country now, is named for that. So the Persian Gulf is the Persian Gulf because if anything, it shows a part that's Persian, even, not as much as it should. But at least that should be acceptable. It was acceptable all the way to 1967. It was only in 1967 and on that the Arabs started, and that was because of the rivalry between the Shah and the late Gamal Abdel Nasser and all of that this happened. The Arabs began agitating about calling it the Arabian Gulf.
Of course. Any other questions?
So you're talking about how you should think of your articles as commercial pieces and pitch them to editors, but then how do you find the balance of not just writing about the stuff that sells and it's true to yourself, like the stuff that you're actually interested in, not just gearing toward the audience and like trying to sell your piece instead of writing something you're actually interested in, you're actually enjoy about.
Packaging is a big part of this. It really depends on how you package your ideas. So one person could, I could have, for instance, that piece about Iranian carpets, I could have just pitched it as a historical piece and analyzed in depth, Iranian carpets and just talked about, their history. Or I could, that's what I did. I tried to, you have to tell them why their readers would be interested in reading about that subject. So, okay, I'm interested in it, but let me see if I can somehow frame it in a way that would appeal to that editor and the magazine's readers. So make connections to pop culture and talk about, the influence of these carpets on, I talked about, fashion, for instance. I even went into music, all sorts of things. So it really turned out to be a good fit for that publication as BBC Culture. So it depends a lot on how you frame things. So you might think you have a really niche subject that no one wants to, would be interested in reading about, but if you can sometimes, that's the art of this, really. That's the, not the necessarily difficult part, but I guess it is the difficult part, trying to, as you said, find a balance between what you're interested in and what can bring in readers for a publication. It's just how you frame things. So one person, as they say, it's not the story, it's how you tell it. So one person could approach a magazine with, they might want to write about, let's say, Nizami for, to make things easier. We've been talking about him. One person would want to analyze the works of Nizami. Okay, like that wouldn't necessarily, that would be too scholarly for a publication like, let's say, the New York Times maybe. But if you talk about Nizami and his relation to Eric Clapton and Layla and Turandot, the opera, now people can relate to that idea. So you're making it less abstract and you're taking it out of this realm of academia and the obscure, and you're anchoring it to things that people can really relate to and that they're interested in reading about. So they might not care about Nizami, but if they care about Clapton, they'll want to read about they'll want to read the article and learn about Nizami, if you see what I'm saying. So you just have to find a way to package the